Hello again, Steve here, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about keeping it sweet and simple. KISS, otherwise known as different terms, keep it simple, silly, and so on. And it has to do with how sometimes we overcomplicate our lives and we get involved with things that are overcomplicated, and sometimes to get the same job done, we can do things simpler, last better, we're in better connection with what we're doing essentially, right? So I just wanted to use a simple example of what I do. I like to drive older rigs. I like to tinker, of course, one thing. And the other thing is they're simpler. I mean, I like to have a crank window on my driver's door. I find it's not a whole lot extra effort to move my arm around in a circle rather than push a button. I'm driving anyway, and it's simpler. It lasts longer. It hardly ever breaks down. I like to have a manual gearbox. It's simpler. You make better fuel economy and less to break down, right? And on this old truck that I have, it has dual fuel tanks, and historically they had like this electric switchover valve, which is always problematic, especially if you drive in slushy and dirty and muddy conditions and what have you. It eventually conks out and then you only have one tank. And it can even be worse than one tank. Like on the weekend I was driving and they failed. It has a supply and return line through the switchover valve. And it failed in such a way that it was sucking from one tank and returning to the other tank. So there I am pumping fuel out, a steady trail of fuel out down the highway. So I had to get under there and I had to shunt it over and hook it directly into one tank, which is a pain in the you-know-what. So what I decided to do was keep it simple and go manual. And today I found something at a boat hardware store. I found a three-way valve, a manual three-way valve. Simple. Yes, I would have to get out and I'm going to have it just under the chassis. So I just lean over and flip it from one side to the other. Yes, that is getting out. Yes, that is extra. But here's the thing. There's a fuel gauge for each tank. I can see where I'm at. It's quite simple. And I generally don't drive continuously because it's about more than 300 kilometers per tank. So very often I stop anyways for some reason along that route. And it's about leaning over and turning a valve. And it's a valve that will last, 25, 30 years. It's a solid hunk of brass with a ball valve in it. Extremely simple. So keep it simple. Sometimes in life we overcomplicate things and we go too far in a way. And I've seen it a number of times. I talked about it in different videos and so on. And it's sort of like the pendulum, right? We swing the pendulum in one direction. Eventually we get to a point where we start coming back in. And I think the pendulum of overcomplication has gone to an extent that people are now coming back to more simplicity. People are growing gardens again. People are looking at what really matters in life in a way, right? I remember talking about this in a video one time about how everybody was, cell phones, they're going to be like the size of your thumbnail or something like that. Everything's getting smaller, more and more micro. And I started thinking, I don't think so. Because you get to the point where the functionality of it is such that it's too small already. Like it's an example of a pendulum swing, right? And I remember seeing it because I remember seeing the first cell phone I ever saw, I believe was in about 1989 or 1990. There was a guy standing in a store and he had this thing that he had to hold on like this, and it was from here, it had an antenna going way up, and it was from here all the way down to here. It was like it looked like a World War II field telephone or something like that, right? And this was a cell phone, and it had like a harness that you had to hook on and carry it around, and only very important people had them. They got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller to the point where there was ones about this long that had a flip on them. Other ones didn't have a flip, and then they had an antenna, and then they didn't have an antenna, and they were really great. They were quite small. And at that point, people were saying, "Wow, these things are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. When are the nanos coming out?" And then came along the smartphone. And they started getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And now there's tablets which people use as their phone, essentially. It's a massive thing with a big screen on it, right? Because it got too small to be functional, and people's fingers were too big and fat to touch the buttons and what have you. So it went the other way. And though this is not a complicated machine at all, this is an older truck and so on, but it's an example of adding too much complexity. Even that little switchover valve is too much complexity when you're driving in salt, slush, and snow and everything, because it all gets into there eventually, and the wiring conks out or something fails. These old GMs, they were notorious for that. I mean, it's sort of, if you go and buy one, the question is, does the switchover valve work? Because usually they don't. Usually you're down to one tank or whatever, or you know. But I suspect with this little simple, keeping it simple, three-way valve, which is actually, it's a boat. It's used for fuel too, but it's made for boats. I got it at a boat store, and apparently on boats, when you have dual tanks, they keep it simple, right? Because you don't want electrics and potential sparks down in the bilge where there's fuel. So you keep it simple, and you use just a little simple brass ball valve, and you manually switch it over when it's ready to be switched. So I'm going to try that, and I suspect it will work, and it will work with a little bit of extra effort, in the way that a crank window is just a little bit of extra effort, but will last longer, be more durable, more functional in some ways. And there's nothing worse than having something that's supposed to work but doesn't work. And it's raining and pouring rain and stuff, and you have fuel in the other tank, but you can't use it because it won't switch over. With this thing, my bet is it's a matter of toggling this from one position to another, and there's the other tank. It's a beautiful thing. Well, keep it simple. What do you think? Sometimes it's a good idea, and I think now more than ever is a good time in our inner Genie paths. The simpler way to get the same job done is probably a good idea. Talk again soon. Bye for now.